Alright folks, it's time to start to talk about color grading. Color grading is, frankly, where most students either love or hate doing any of this. Color grading is, by large, the biggest impact that you can have artistically on a scene or a shot. In this video, what I've done to the post-process volume is I've set up the post-process volume to be infinite extents unbound. In the demo following this, I will do a very quick and very, at least somewhat thorough demo for setting up a very quick scene. I already have a plan for what I want to do. I've done this demo before. So what I'm going to do in the next demo is I'm going to do a scene utilizing post-process volumes to get an example of what I want to do. I'm going to take a before and after screenshot, and then I will show you guys the difference and how much you can do with the post-process volume in terms of getting the effects that you want from the visual fidelity of your game. Now, that does not mean that the post-process volume is entirely used for all of that. In reality, the post-process volume is typically used just to get a certain color grading or a certain kind of mood or tone for your scenes. It makes your nighttime scenes look more realistic. It makes your daytime scenes look more colorful, so on and so forth. The cinematic camera, which we'll talk about in a future lecture, is also quite powerful and contains its own settings. But each of those settings are on a camera-to-camera basis. So let's think of it this way. The post-process volume is supposed to set the look and feel and fidelity for what the level is supposed to look like. However, if you're recording sequencer cinematics for your game, then what you are going to be focused on with the camera settings is trying to achieve the best cinematic look that you can through the cinematic cameras. And those two settings do play with each other. And it becomes terrifying because you can make more changes inside of the Cine camera, in the sequencer camera, on top of the settings that you've already made inside the post-process volume. So as you can see, it can become very, very complicated very, very quickly. But don't worry, what I usually tell people is if you're going to be working on cinematics, then you're going to have everything is already set up for you, and therefore the only thing that you have to worry about capturing with the camera is making sure you're capturing the best cinematics possible. If you are working on the game, working on a game environment, working on the game lighting, or are a level designer, what you are going to be focused on is making sure that the post-process volume is capturing and setting the game world and tone the way that it's supposed to be played and experienced mostly by the player. Whereas the cinematics crew will worry mostly about the cinematics and creating sequencer images and then recording video for their shots. You're going to be more worried about how the game is going to look. All right, now that with that primer out of the way, I'm going to have a seat here, and we're going to go ahead and talk about color grading. Okay, for this demo, I have some color grading LUTs. Let me actually go ahead and bring those in. Let's go ahead and close the engine content folder, new folder, LUTs, and then I'm just going to drag and drop these bad boys in there. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. Let me pause for a second. My virtual machine got a little bit weird for a sec. Why are you being weird, virtual machine? There we go. There we go. All my LUTs are in now. We'll talk about these in a sec. Let me save those. Cool, cool. All right, we can minimize that. So let's talk about color grading. Color grading, we can go ahead and close that for now. Oh, we can leave that open. Color grading is the process by which you essentially use color correction. It's used to enhance the overall color of the light in the scene. That's the long and short. We have HDR displays now, and we need to be able to preserve color better because that's just kind of how HDR images work. And because we have HDR images and HDR screens, we have to make sure that the best color that we can produce is what's showing up on the screens of the of our viewers, so to speak. So back in the day, which was actually like 22 2008 to 2010, up until like 2014, 2015, it was kind of expected that you would use color correction through something called a lookup table. We won't talk in this class about how to make them. I have a collection. I'll give you guys some. Which happens to be a low definition kind of approach to color, low definition range, that was supposed to output into the monitor something that was like in linear sRGB. So when we have our modern displays, a lookup table does not necessarily give us the correct amount of color and exposure control that we need in order to get those values. What we're seeing here are lookup tables. They're kind of old school. They're still considered an industry standard in some places. I don't necessarily like using them for games, but for cinematics they work relatively well. You know, it is what it is. Generally speaking, you should be, if you are working in an environment that requires some kind of visual production, you will be working with LUTs. You will have to then modify the LUTs using color grading and color control. Otherwise, you'll probably just use a LUT and then be told to leave it alone. Or you'll be manually color grading with somebody assisting, or somebody, either your principal of photography or someone telling you how to color grade it, or be sitting with you while you're color grading in real time. So let's talk about these individual settings and we'll go from there. So in the color grading section, which we're in now, which is above film, which we skipped earlier, let's go ahead and take a look at these sections. So under each section, you'll be able to use individual color wheels. Let's actually look at one that actually has one. Shadows has one. You'll be able to use individual color wheels. Make that a little bigger. To set up what each of these settings is supposed to be. You have your RGB, which is your red, green, blue values, which is this over here. Or you can set this up in HSV, which is hue and saturation values. So, generally speaking, you will probably always want to be, let's go ahead and set, now I set this up for Infinite Extents Unbound. See if we can change the values here. Oh, did I not set it for Infinite Extents Unbound? Let's double check. I could swear I did, but let's be certain we did. Okay, we did. Alright, good. Just not rendering right away. No worries. Let's go back up here. Let's actually go to something that's going to make a profound effect, and I'll take a look once that's taken care of. Okay. So you see that each of these settings does have its own amount of control. And if you hold down Shift, you can actually get a little bit more granular control. So you can use the regular mouse control to move things around, and also you can hold down Shift to get some more granular control. That one I just turned on for gamma. I'll explain what each of these do as we go through them. But I kind of wanted to show you what each section can do and how this works and how each precise control works. So let's go ahead and close this down, and we'll start at the very top and we'll work our way around. Let's go ahead and go to the screen here. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to check, make sure my lighting is set to movable so I don't have to deal with any problems here. And then I'm going to try to cast a longer shadow so that my elements look at least slightly convincing. More. Good enough. Okay. Select the post-process volume. Don't misclick the post-process volume. And we'll go ahead and talk about these. So, white balance essentially is pretty straightforward. So the properties in that section adjust the colors of the scene so that the whites appear truly white and whatnot. Don't think of it as controlling your black levels. Think of it controlling as your white intensity levels. So this being correct allows you to set the other colors correctly in the scene, including your blacks. You have temperature and tint. Temperature works exactly as you'd think. Your temperature will adjust the white balance in relation to the temperature of the light in the scene, right? So when the light temperature and the light value in the scene are similar, then what's going to happen is you're going to get a white color or a white-ish color, right? When a value that is higher is used, it's going to be warmer. And conversely, if the value is lower, it's going to be a cooler or blue color. I know this is kind of opposite of the Kelvin scale, because technically temperature is not the same as the Kelvin temperature for grading. I know it's a little bit weird, but generally speaking, this controls your white levels to be either cooler or warmer. That's basically it. Cool colors on the left, warmer colors on the right. That's pretty straightforward. Your tint is just your overall balance temperature. So the way that you want to use this setting is once you've already got this set to the correct, let's go ahead and set this to the default. Once you've already got this set to the correct color balance that you want, let's say we wanted something a little bit warmer than that. You can use a tint to then modify the overall setting of the color itself to be more akin to the color that you want. Yes, you can get incredibly zany colors this way too. This is almost like your old school remote tint. For those of you guys who remember setting the tint values on an old school TV, if you're old enough, that's more or less the same. If you guys are wondering why I have to wiggle it every time, it's because my GI isn't updated immediately. And because it's not updating immediately, I have to kind of move it around to make sure that it works. Essentially, this is used to balance the color to look more natural or more unnatural depending on what you're doing. So even though it's like a pinkish, it doesn't look too bad. It still has kind of a realistic look to it. And again, these two are tied to each other. Let's go ahead and set them back to its default. Let's go ahead and turn them off. And let's wiggle the scene to get back their default color. Okay. Our global settings is where a lot of the work gets done. So the properties in this section are essentially the global set of color corrections that you can use for a scene. Most of your time is going to be spent in global color correction. That's pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and open up saturation. And this controls essentially the purity of the colors. That's it. I usually mess with this particular slider, but if you bias towards a certain direction, or if you want to use different HSV values, or if you want to, for example, you have a very specific color range that you want to work with. Typically speaking, if you want to modify everything unilaterally, you reset, and then you change your colors according to what you want. But if you want, say, more of a green tone, then we just kind of crank the green value up. Wiggle that. We see that we only have one color channel, so that's the green channel right there. Let's go ahead and reset it. So you see kind of how these tones control the saturation. Not necessarily do the colors impact how the saturation works, because that's where our white balance and our global is supposed to be, as well as our tint. But this controls essentially what our global saturation is supposed to look like. So if we want more intense colors, what I'll typically do is I'll come in here and then I'll add some value in here. And as I do that, maybe I'll play around with this to see if I can get some colors that I want. Or if you care mostly about the hue, saturation, and values, which is typically the default value that we have in Unreal Engine. So for example, I'll set this to maybe that value, and then try to modify the values as, oh, sorry, wrong thing, HSV. And then I'll modify my values as necessary to get the appropriate saturation that I want. Some people like working in RGB though. It's up to you really which you like working in. Let's go ahead and close that off and we'll move on. Contrast is exactly what it sounds like. Let's go ahead and pop that open. This adjusts the range of dark and light colors. Generally, I like to scrub these. I don't like to try to manipulate which color I'm going to get, but I'll scrub them based on what I want, and then if I want a very particular look. But again, I'm messing with contrast. I'm not necessarily trying to do color matching inside of here. It can get a little bit ugly if you're trying to affect colors somewhat in a setting that only affects, say, something like contrast. Lowering the intensity removes the highlights and lighten the image, and this will give us a washed out look. And then raising will give us a more intense, kind of hotter look. And yes, you can in fact put higher values in there. Doesn't that look familiar? You see kind of the overall result nonetheless. Typically, I'll start with making changes down here before I make any changes to the color platform. Turn those off. Let's go back up here. Get a better look at the scene. Oops. Click on that. Gamma correction. No, this is not like Bruce Banner's gamma energy or anything like that. I've heard that joke way too many times. This is luminance. That's all it is. I like to gamma correct at around a 1.6 because that's an old school thing that I used to do whenever I was back. For whatever reason, back in the day, our professors liked to have prints of a scene that we were looking at, so we had to actually go to the printing office and have our scenes printed for a board. So we would present our scenes, and what I discovered is, that was old school Unreal, is that upgrading the gamma correction to like 1.6 or 1.3 made the scene look decent when they were printed out. So what you're doing there with your gamma correction is it's just the intensity of the luminance. Lowering the value or raising the value will be either too washed out or too dark. That's it. Let's turn that off. Let's do gain, and no, not the soap. I've heard that joke before. This controls the intensity of the whites. So you can see it has kind of a similar effect to contrast. But again, this controls kind of the overall whiteness of the scene and the overall brights. If we add a higher value in there, we see that we get brighter and brighter and brighter, but we don't get like that kind of weird clamp that we had earlier with like that kind of blue color. Personally, what I do is I hold down Shift, and then I'm going to just kind of massage to see what setting is going to look the best for my scene. But again, this is just the luminance intensity of the scene's whites. That's really all there is to it. Let's go ahead and close these. I'm not going to worry too much about shadows for now. This setting can be a little bit weird. We'll talk about that in a sec. We'll skip that one for now. Let's see. I want to talk about the other ones, though. So we talked about... Well, let's go back into global here. Have any other settings? Let's talk about offset. We'll turn that off. Or turn that on, excuse me. Offset deals with your black intensity. So say you can work with both contrast and offset. Right? There's that, and then we'll gain up the whites. To get kind of like this weirdly kind of spooky look that is part of the way that our game is supposed to be designed. This is how they made... For anyone here who's played, what's it called? Oh, what the heck was that game called? I need to actually look it up now. No, wait, I remember. It's Mirror's Edge. This is where a lot of the clamping gets done to make sure that elements can be set up properly. So we can see how those effects become cumulative. Turn down the contrast, turn down the gain, turn off the offset, and we're back to our default look. I like how washed out it looks now that we've been looking at it with full blacks. It looks kind of washed out to me. But you get the idea. Again, just as a reminder, your offset is designed to help you offset the colors of your black levels. Gamma, gain, and offset are essentially working in conjunction with your default saturation and contrast. My secret to good scene design is do your saturation and contrast first, and then leave them alone, and then make any tweaks in gamma correction, gain correction, and offset correction. You don't want to fight these two. These two should set your white and black levels. This is what's going to set your white and black levels globally and set your min and max, and the other ones are where you tweak the in-betweens. Of course, you want to go into shadows as well too. We won't talk about LUT for now. That's going to be down here, so we'll talk about that in a sec. Shadows. The properties in there are going to be similar, so I'm only going to talk about shadows and midtones, but they're fundamentally the same. I'll just talk about shadows, but then you can assume the same for midtones and highlights, and I will encourage you guys to play around with them when you get an opportunity to do so, and I'll do so in the demo here shortly. So, the shadow properties generally control the color correction of shadow values in the scene. So shadows have their own, right? We have a white balance and then we have shadows. Let's see if we can actually get some kind of result here if I'm looking at the shadows this time. You can kind of see the result, but it's not really doing much. Let's see. Let's wiggle that, turn it up, wiggle it again. It's kind of hard to tell because my scene isn't updating in real time because it's being streamed in. But we can see that the saturation of the shadows does in fact change a little bit. See how it's kind of a bluish? Let's go ahead and go back down. It's more like a blackish. Let's go ahead and maybe pump this up to a 10. See, now it's too deep. Now it's too the value is too high, so let's go ahead and bring this back down. There we go. We can kind of see that result now. So essentially, this will adjust the purity of the color that's being represented. Higher values will make it so that the colors of the sky, which is mostly RGB, or the colors of the scene will appear mostly. And when the saturator goes lower, or when the saturation goes lower, excuse me, everything gets more gray and washed out. Typically, you'll want your shadows a little bit more gray, unless you're looking for like kind of a more colorful and bright game. Then you'll want to up the saturation in order to get the color of the environment to sync a little bit more with the color of the shadow. Let's A/B that. See how kind of that looks more like a regular shadow, and this is kind of brighter, more alive, I guess you could say, if you want to call it that. Let's go ahead and desaturate it and leave it alone. Cool. Contrast, same thing as the previous one. Contrast. Let's go ahead and pop that open. Turn it on. So this adjusts the tonal range for the shadow compensation. Man, that looks super weird. It almost looks like a trip. Do that so we can see what it's doing. Okay. So essentially lowering the intensity removes highlights and lightens the shadows, and then you'll get kind of a washed out look, whereas higher intensity tightens the highlights. Let's do that again. And you'll get kind of a darker look. Pretty straightforward. I know this seems very dry, everybody, but just kind of follow me along here. We're almost done with this section. We'll get into LUT, and then we'll get into the actual demo, and then it'll be almost quitting time. So let's go from there. Playing around with the gamma. Again, you set your saturation and contrast first, and then mess with your gamma. This adjusts the luminance intensity. This controls washed in or washed out. So it seems almost like the opposite effect over as lower, too much or not enough contrast. Let's mess with the contrast here. See kind of how this effect lives on this end, but the gamma correction lives on the other end. This is why you want to make your tweaks first to saturation and contrast, and then tweak later with gamma and gain and offset. Let's go back to gain. Open that up. Controls the shadows gain. This is just the luminance intensity. And then of course offset, finally. This allows you to control the value of the shadows. So we can see we can do some really kind of janky stuff here. Not entirely my favorite thing. Um, Again, this is just tweaking. These last three are tweaking. The first two set the standard. Shadows Max is a multiplier. Essentially, it boosts all these color correction properties. Since we don't have a lot of color correction properties on, let's go ahead and turn on contrast. Oh, my goodness. Let's set this back to default. Let's see if we can get some boost here. You can see kind of how that effect is kind of changing. What it is, it's a multiplier of the properties that affect the color corrections that have been adjusted in Shadows. Shadows Max, there's also a Midtones Max and a Highlights Max. This is once you've actually done all of your tweaking and you need just to make a little bit of touch correction. You see how the values are incredibly small. I'm holding down Shift. This is where you will make your final touches to make your shadows max. What it is a multiplier to all the stuff that's in here that you have turned on. It's likely at this point that you have all of these values turned on, and then this will adjust all of the sliders at the same time within a value range. And the same thing goes for midtones. And highlights. That one's not going to be as obvious because of saturation. Let's go to... the highlights usually appear at the top of certain elements. We can see that the sky gets its own highlight if we turn that all the way off. But you see that the highlights do show up on other elements. Ah, that one's more obvious. Let's go ahead and turn that up. And play around. That deals only with highlights. This scene doesn't have a ton of highlights, but we can see that we have like a nice kind of bluish greenish color very lightly on there. We turn that off. We can see how that affects overall. Again, there's a lot more settings in here that we can spend time on talking about midtones, talking about highlights. Let's go ahead and disable some of these settings here. And let's go ahead and finish this discussion up with the discussion on our miscellaneous here. Blue correction has to do with aces. Essentially, if we have too much blue correction or not enough blue, how can I explain this a little bit better? If you're having blue artifacts in the scene, this is where you will do your blue correction. This essentially is an error correcting switch. In order to make the error, I'd have to actually physically light this entire scene. I might still have to in the other scene. I might use that. This is what happens if the blues get shoved off into another mathematical table, or rather they get so extreme, which is typically you'll see in HDR images, so get a lot of blue light because blue light gets captured pretty easily. If you're having a very high kind of electric blue, your blue correction will fix that. It will turn it more into violet as opposed to let it get clamped and look really ugly. Expand gamma, we don't have to worry too much about that one. This is if you have, it even says it right there, it expands your colors outside of sRGB to get like a very, very fake looking render. Never used it, don't plan on it. It's just there to know, it's just there if you need it for some reason. Tone curve amount, I don't worry about these. These aren't super important. The one that's important is right down here, but we'll get to it. Tone curve amount, if you're using some kind of tonal value that is based on a camera, like a red camera, this is where you would want to set it. If you're trying to mimic a very specific camera, that's where you would set it. Cameras have a tone curve. Some cameras are bluer, some cameras are more red, some cameras are a little bit softer. This is where that curve is going to be adjusted. Scene color tint might not have an effect, but it is an overall scene color. I don't know why you would want to use that, especially when you have the other controls over here. like your temp and tint, but I guess if you really want a tint correction, there it is. And then we have what's called a color grading LUT. Let's go ahead and turn these two on. And let's go ahead and grab one of the LUTs here. What's a good LUT color? Let's do a purple table. LUT. And let's do daytime. Actually, no, let's do, what's a good one? Let's do purple table, the one that I said was going to be blue purple table. There we go. So what a LUT is it uses this color range right here to figure out what our scene color is going to look like. And then we can increase or decrease that color intensity based on what the LUT is supposed to show. So here's a sunset LUT table. You can see it does a lot of the color grading for us. Let's horror blue. Yeah, that one's creepy. This is almost like a nighttime LUT that you would want to use. Do you folks remember the nighttime demo that we did? I mentioned this off the cuff. This is where you would continue to use a color grading system inside of Unreal Engine to really get that correct horror vibe. Let's set this back to a default of 1. You can see how there's a lot of problems with that particular LUT that you would then correct using the color correction. It looks like the shadows are wrong. Let's see if I can fix them with a little bit of gain here. There we go. So now the shadows are correct. Do you see how you use this technology? That's the point. The point is to be able to use the technology. Oh, it looks like our highlights are messed up too. You want to use the technology to kind of fix and create issues that you can solve. Let's set this to like a 0.5 value, maybe 0.75. Yeah, look at that. Or let's go ahead and change the value again. Let's do foggy night. Or let's do desert. Ah, as you can see, now the sky gets some weird color grading angles. We can go in and regrade them back so that they don't look really ugly or really intense. Or we can back this off a little bit to see if we get something a little more comfortable. Nope, it looks like there's still some values that are a little bit too far clamped. But that's where you want to go back and start changing those elements, right? Here's afternoon. Now let's disable the LUT to see what the difference between the default lighting and the LUT is. And you see it's very subtle, right? But the subtlety does matter when it comes to how you are conducting and kind of doing your color correction scene. So let me go ahead and kind of give you the same advice that the documentation is going to give you with some of my personal advice. We won't talk about the other settings for now. We'll talk about them in the future at some point. But again, this is an intro level. This is supposed to be an intro color grading class. I could teach an entire course on color grading. Just know that it exists, and just know that you guys have the capacity to kind of play around with it. I would strongly encourage you to give it an opportunity to play around. I'll give you guys a scene for your homework, and then I'll ask you guys to make the scene look different depending on these color tables and whatnot, and go ahead and have fun. That's what the homework is going to be. So let's go ahead and talk here. Just like I said, film should be the first thing that you set and the last time you set it. You should not mess around too much with the film. You do not want to change them afterwards, because if you go back and change them, you mess everything up. You have to regrade everything. Yep. Set it once at the very beginning. If you accept the defaults are honestly fine. I think they're fine. Once you're getting ready for color correction, start with global. Do not start with white balance. I hate that they put it at the top. Start with your global color correction. That's it. Start with global, make those changes solid, and then go from there. Do not use gain. I know I used it a little bit to make that correction, but you saw how sloppy it was to make that correction to the shadow. Don't use gain for exposure. Use the... Let's see if I want to do that. where is my exposure bias? Yeah. If you need to change exposure, do not use gain to add more light or more shadow to your scene unless you are editing only one element at a time. If you need more light or less light, use your exposure compensation. Right? If you need more light, don't mess around with the shadows just to get them looking better, and then mess with the light to get the light brighter. You get darker shadows. You get darker shadows by having brighter light. When you have more light to work with, you can see how the gamma is kind of messing around with that. I'd have to go back, remove the gamma, but if you need more light, you should use the exposure section. You should use exposure compensation if you need more light. You should not use gain to give more light. You should use gain to make minor corrections. Now, the documentation says that lookup tables are bad. You know, use lookup tables the way that I use lookup tables. I use a lookup table to figure out what the look is supposed to be like, and then I try to reproduce what that scene is supposed to look like. I use lookup tables for visual development, for VizDev. I will remove the lookup table after I'm done with it. So after I'm done getting the color as close as possible, what I'll do is I'll A/B this and I'll try to see if I get it close. I'll disable it. The problem with it is this is clamped to an image and cannot be trusted to look the same on every monitor. The other settings, however, can. Alright? Also, be judicious with your use of offset, particularly shadow offset. If you want to give things a nice little haze, or if you want things to look a little bit more bloomy, use offset to control those midtones, or those shadows, or those highlights. Offset is going to be what you want to do to change the contrast a little bit once you've actually set the contrast. So, for example, let's see if I can grab the offset here. See? This is a much easier result to control than going back up and messing with the contrast again. Because if you mess with the contrast again, you mess with the contrast for just about everything in the scene. So now that I've messed with the contrast here, I've messed with everything else. So now I need to go back to the offset down here and then fix it manually. Use offset as the very last thing. So, set your film, start with global color correction, be careful with gain, use offset to correct the last little touches, and then don't always use a lookup table. There is a training stream that talks about the filmic tone mapper. I will include it. It's going to be boring because they cover a lot of the same things that I already covered in this video, but I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this particular demo, and in the next demo, I'm going to very quickly set up our lovely scene so I can show you what a workflow is supposed to look like when it comes to dealing with this kind of stuff. All right? So I've covered everything that I need to cover about the post process. I will give you guys lookup tables. I will give you a scene to work with, and then we'll go from there. All right? I will see you guys in the next video.